Like and subscribe if you despise complainers, and let me know from which city or country you're watching. That was my opening call as the moving van groaned its last protest in front of my new home. Yes, my home now. After years of scrimping, saving, and surviving on instant noodles, I, Detective Terrence Wilcox of the Metro Police, had finally become a homeowner. The modest, two-story bungalow wasn't much to behold, its once vibrant aquamarine paint now faded, a slightly off-center porch swaying in a gentle breeze, and a lawn that looked like it hadn't been touched by a mower since the Reagan era. But, to me, it was perfect. I had earned it. I stepped out of the moving van, stretched my sore muscles, and surveyed my new realm with a detective's keen eye. The neighborhood was oddly quiet, populated by young families and elderly folks tending to their flower beds. Perhaps too quiet, I mused. Being a cop, I was always naturally wary of any sign of trouble. Just as I was about to wrestle the first box of my belongings from the van, a figure emerged from the house next door. And not just any neighbor, but a true exemplar of entitlement. There she was, Eleanor Peterson. Her platinum blonde hair, sculpted like a helmet, and oversized designer sunglasses perched precariously on her nose left no doubt that she was a modern-day Karen. In her stance was a power that could rival a seasoned bully. "Excuse me," she barked, her voice sugary yet biting as she took in the scene. "Are you aware that this is a residential neighborhood?" I sighed internally. "Yes, ma'am," I replied with a polite smile, one I usually reserved for hardened criminals who suddenly feel remorse. "I just bought the house." I even pulled up the deed on my phone, ensuring she saw the evidence. Her eyes narrowed behind those oversized lenses. "Bought it? But the Petersons have lived here for generations. Surely there must be some mistake." I held up my phone. "I have the deed right here," I said. That's when her performance truly began. Suddenly, Eleanor clutched her chest as if struck by a heart attack. "Oh dear Lord, I think I'm having a panic attack. I just can't believe an outsider is moving in," she shrieked. I nearly stifled a chuckle. I, a 6 feet 2 inches detective, built like a linebacker and as dark as midnight, was now ticking off every box on her neighborhood nightmare bingo card. "Ma'am, are you all right? Perhaps I should call someone." I reached for my phone, half expecting to dial 911 myself. "Don't you dare," she screamed, snatching her phone from her designer bag. "I'll call the police. I need to know who's moving in next door. I find this highly suspicious." With that, she launched into a full-blown rant over the phone. I shook my head and got back to unloading the moving van, already sensing that my first day in this quiet cul-de-sac was about to become anything but ordinary. After the initial shock of Eleanor Peterson's theatrical entrance, I set about settling into my new place. With boxes scattered and memories of my past life tucked away, I felt a cautious excitement in finally owning a home. As I began unloading the last few boxes from the moving van, the silence was abruptly shattered by a piercing sound, the shrill, indignant voice of Eleanor. Before I could even place another box, Eleanor emerged again, phone clutched tightly in her manicured hand. "Devon, excuse me, Detective Wilcox," she barked. "I demand to speak with someone in authority. How dare you move in like some interloper?" I forced a smile and replied, "Ma'am, I just bought this house legally. I have all the necessary documents on my phone if you'd like to see them." I pulled up the deed, hoping to diffuse her mounting agitation. But Eleanor's reaction was not what I expected. Her eyes widened dramatically as she theatrically clutched her chest. "Oh, my. I think I'm having a heart attack. This is an outrage. How can an outsider possibly move in and disrupt the delicate balance of our community?" she wailed. I couldn't help but feel a pang of amusement beneath my annoyance. "Ma'am," I said, trying to keep my tone respectful yet firm, "I assure you, I'm just as much a part of this neighborhood as anyone else. I'm a homeowner now just like you." Her voice escalated in volume and passion. "I will not stand for this. I'm calling the police. I have every right to know who is moving in next door. With that, she snapped her phone shut and marched back to her porch, already dialing 911. I shrugged and got back to work, but minutes later, the sound of approaching sirens punctuated the quiet street. I saw a police cruiser pull up, its lights flashing. Two officers stepped out, one young and eager, the other a seasoned veteran with a look that suggested he'd seen it all before. The young officer approached Eleanor, his hand hovering near his holster as a formality. "Ma'am, can you please explain what's going on?" he asked politely. Eleanor launched into her story, her tone a mix of indignation and trembling anxiety. She claimed that I had somehow harassed her by moving my belongings into the neighborhood without proper clearance, accusing me of being a suspicious outsider. I listened, exasperation growing inside me, then calmly interjected. "Officer, I'm Detective Terrence Wilcox of the Metro Police. I just purchased this property, and I have the deed here." I held up my phone for all to see. The young officer's eyes widened as he looked at the screen, stammering, "Oh, my apologies, Detective." Meanwhile, the veteran officer, whom I later learned was named Officer Franklin, nodded knowingly and said, "Welcome to the neighborhood, Wilcox. Looks like you've already made an impression." Officer Franklin then addressed Eleanor with a sardonic smile. "Ma'am, you should consider returning inside and perhaps organizing your garden or your decorative knickknacks instead of causing a commotion." Eleanor sputtered, mumbling about declining property values and societal decay, and retreated to her porch with a huff. With the police matter seemingly resolved, I resumed unloading the van, though the morning's chaos left me with a simmering mix of irritation and resolve. I knew that Eleanor's dramatic antics were only just beginning, and that I, as a newly minted homeowner and a detective, would soon have to deal with far more than just boxes in a moving van. After the police cruiser drove away, I stood for a moment in the quiet aftermath, my mind replaying every exaggerated expression and overblown declaration from Eleanor Peterson. The ordeal left me not so much angry as determined to ensure that this Karen would never again disrupt my life, and perhaps teach her a lesson in humility. I finished unpacking while meticulously noting every detail of the encounter. It wasn't long before I decided that my detective instincts weren't meant solely for the force, but could be put to use on a more personal scale. I resolved, then and there, that Eleanor Peterson would soon learn what it meant to meddle in someone's life without consequences. Back at my modest bungalow, I settled into my small home office and began gathering information. Using my extensive network of contacts within the Metro Police and a few friendly favors, I compiled a file on Eleanor, a file thicker than the local phone directory. I discovered that despite her haughty demeanor and self-proclaimed status as the neighborhood moral compass, Eleanor had a complicated past. For starters, she claimed to be the long-standing matriarch of the Peterson family, yet records showed her family had only recently settled in the area. I dug deeper. Through discreet interviews with other neighbors. Reticent at first, then increasingly emboldened by my polite inquiries, I learned that Eleanor was not universally beloved. In hushed tones, several residents mentioned her domineering attitude at homeowners association meetings, her relentless policing of trivial matters like lawn ornament placement, and even accusations of bullying, intimidation, and petty harassment. Beneath her pristine exterior, it seemed she harbored secrets that contradicted her public persona. Armed with this information, I began to formulate my plan. I decided that subtle acts of defiance would be the best weapon, quiet yet effective gestures that would undercut her authority without resorting to direct confrontation. My first step was to transform my own property in small but visible ways that directly contradicted the neighborhood's rigid, sanitized image that Eleanor so cherished. Every day for the next couple of weeks, I maintained my front yard with obsessive precision. I mowed it twice a week, fertilized the soil meticulously, and even hired a local landscaper to plant an array of vibrant, mismatched flowers along the curb. I deliberately chose colors and designs that clashed with the dull, uniform aesthetics that Eleanor often promoted. Her frustration was palpable whenever she happened upon these changes, her perfectly manicured ideals thrown off balance. Next, I began attending every homeowners association meeting. I listened patiently to Eleanor drone on about trivial issues, proper placement of mailboxes, color schemes for communal areas, and, at one point, even the appropriate angle for a fence post. At carefully chosen moments, I would step in and politely, but firmly, challenge her decrees. Each well-timed disagreement was designed to highlight the absurdity of her demands, and over time, I noticed other residents nodding in agreement, emboldened by my willingness to question authority. At the same time, I made a concerted effort to befriend the other neighbors. In everyday encounters, I listened more than I spoke, subtly sowing seeds of doubt about Eleanor's infallibility. Casual conversation sometimes took an unexpected turn. One day, over a cup of coffee in the community park, I mentioned offhand that Eleanor's version of family history didn't exactly match public records. These small comments gradually made their way through the grapevine, and soon, whispers began to circulate about the real nature of the neighborhood patriot. All the while, I maintained the facade of the agreeable new homeowner, a man who was amiable, unassuming, and eager to contribute to the community. It was the perfect cover. Eleanor, blinded by her own arrogance, assumed that everyone adored her. Her control over the neighborhood was beginning to show signs of crack, and I was determined to exploit every fissure. I kept a close eye on every interaction she had, recording details in my mind, and in discreet notes on my secure device. I ensured that no transgression, however small, escaped my attention. My plan was methodical: erode her influence bit by bit, until the once dominant queen of the cul-de-sac was reduced to a figure of pity. By the end of that period, as whispered conversations and subdued protests began to circulate among the residents, my quiet rebellion was well underway. I relished the knowledge that, little by little, I was restoring balance, and that Eleanor would soon learn that not everyone was willing to submit to her tyrannical standards. The annual neighborhood block party was approaching, a festive event where every resident, regardless of status, gathered in the local park to share food, laughs, and friendly banter. For years, Eleanor Peterson had used these events to assert her dominance, presiding over every conversation with an air of superiority. This year, however, I planned a coup of a different kind. In the days leading up to the party, I meticulously arranged for a surprise that would expose the true face of Eleanor's carefully curated persona. I knew the party would be the perfect stage for public accountability. With help from a few like-minded neighbors and a former associate of Eleanor's, a burly ex-business partner named Tony Reynolds, I set the plan in motion. On the morning of the block party, I spent extra time refining every detail of my property's appearance to send a silent message of defiance. My lawn was immaculate, a vibrant patchwork of colors defying the bland uniformity that Eleanor so adored. I arranged subtle displays of creativity along the walkway, each a silent provocation to her sterile vision of perfection. When the block party day finally arrived, the neighborhood park buzzed with excitement. Eleanor, dressed in her trademark pastel blazer and matching accessories, arrived early and proceeded to assert her authority as usual. She roamed the park with a critical eye, critiquing the setup of decorations and even the placement of picnic tables. I watched her from a distance, waiting for the opportune moment. As the festivities began and friendly chatter filled the air, I discreetly signaled Tony Reynolds, a rugged, no-nonsense man with a shaved head and a gold tooth, who had been lingering at the edge of the crowd. Tony's presence was immediately noticed by many. He was a man whose reputation preceded him, and his very appearance stirred murmurs among those in attendance. The turning point came when Eleanor took the stage to deliver her customary welcome speech. With an air of smug certainty, she began recounting the storied history of the neighborhood and her unyielding commitment to upholding its standards. Just as she reached the apex of her self-congratulation, Tony Reynolds strode onto the stage with deliberate force. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tony boomed, seizing the microphone from Eleanor with a disarming calm, "I'd like to share a few facts about this neighborhood that you might not have heard." A hush fell over the crowd. Eyes shifted between Tony and Eleanor, the tension palpable. Tony then proceeded to recount, in blunt and revealing detail, the discrepancies in Eleanor's long-held claims. He exposed secrets about her late husband's dubious business practices, money laundering with unsavory characters, and how Eleanor had quietly continued those operations long after his passing. He laid out evidence of her bullying and manipulation behind the scenes, the very behavior that had plagued so many of her colleagues and neighbors. The audience gasped, murmurs rippling through the crowd like wildfire. Eleanor's face turned a deep shade of crimson as Tony's revelations laid bare the stark contrast between her polished public image and her hidden transgressions. "This isn't the woman we all thought we knew," Tony declared, his voice rising. "This is the truth of Eleanor Peterson." In that electrifying moment, the carefully constructed facade of control and propriety shattered. Neighbors exchanged shocked glances, and the previously awestruck silence transformed into a chorus of incredulous whispers. As Tony wrapped up his impromptu exposé, the crowd erupted in applause and murmurs of validation. Security cameras and cell phone footage captured every moment, the revelation, Eleanor's mortified expression, and the solidarity among the neighbors. The impact was immediate. Within minutes, local news crews began arriving, and residents, emboldened by the truth, gathered around to discuss the new reality of their once revered community leader. Eleanor tried to salvage the situation, stammering and pleading as she tried to defend herself, but the damage was done. Her reputation, once untouchable, was now in ruins, and the public humiliation was unmistakable. As the chaos of conflicting voices swirled, I stood at the periphery, a quiet satisfaction warming me. I had set things right, not with overt aggression but with the quiet power of truth and unity. By the end of the party, as guests departed and the park slowly emptied, I knew that the tide had turned irrevocably. Eleanor Peterson's dominion over the neighborhood was at an end, and the balance of respect had finally shifted in favor of the many over the entitled few. In the aftermath of the block party revelation, the community was abuzz with the fallout. The once proud Eleanor Peterson was now the subject of hushed gossip and overt disdain. As the dust settled, I, Detective Terrence Wilcox, realized that my quiet quest for justice was only beginning. I wasn't satisfied with merely witnessing her public humiliation, I wanted to ensure she would never again abuse her power. Back at my bungalow, I methodically began putting my next phase of the plan into action. First, I turned my attention to my own property. My yard and curb appeal had become a silent battleground. Every morning, I mowed the lawn with military precision, trimmed the hedges, and even had a local landscaper plant an extravagant array of colorful flowers along the front path. The vibrant display was a direct affront to the drab standards Eleanor had long imposed on the neighborhood. I watched with a wry smile as she would occasionally pass by, her nose wrinkling in displeasure at the sight. Next, I threw myself into community affairs. I started attending every homeowners association meeting, not as a silent observer, but as an active participant. I listened patiently to Eleanor's monotonous recitations about allowable fence heights and proper mailbox alignments. At the opportune moments, I would gently, yet firmly, question her decisions. Have we considered a more inclusive approach to these guidelines? I'd ask, inviting other residents to voice their opinions. Gradually, her iron grip on the meetings began to falter, as neighbors grew emboldened to challenge her authority. But I knew that undermining Eleanor's power required more than a few well-placed questions. I needed to become a fixture in the community, not the aloof detective, but the reliable, relatable neighbor. I attended local potlucks, offered to help with community cleanups, and even organized informal gatherings for residents to discuss common concerns, all the while subtly hinting at the discrepancies in Eleanor's pristine narrative. I'd mention, for example, how historical records sometimes told a different story about longtime residents. These casual remarks slowly eroded the mystique of her supposed legitimacy. In the privacy of my home, I continued to gather more evidence against Eleanor. I made discreet calls to former employees and neighbors, collecting depositions that detailed her harshness, bullying, and disregard for community welfare. Every piece of information was meticulously documented in a confidential file, one that I knew I could use to tilt the balance further in my favor. With each new revelation, my resolve to see her accountability grew stronger. The local media, ever hungry for scandal, picked up on the whispers circulating among residents. Soon, a couple of local reporters began asking probing questions about the apparent decline of community standards. I remained careful and neutral, letting the truth speak for itself. While I didn't air all my secrets publicly, it was clear to everyone with an ear for the local grapevine that Eleanor's spotless image was cracking. One particularly memorable evening, during a casual dinner with a few trusted neighbors, I softly recounted a few of the startling details I had learned about Eleanor. The community listened with a mix of shock and vindication. It was as if the veil had been lifted. Even those who had once defended her started to question the narratives they had been fed for so long. As the weeks turned into months, the seeds of retribution I had planted began to bear fruit. Eleanor's influence over the homeowners association waned noticeably. The meetings became more democratic, with residents freely expressing dissent and new ideas. I, meanwhile, became a quiet beacon of the change that was underway, a symbol of perseverance against tyranny disguised as tradition. Although I never overtly declared war on Eleanor, my every action communicated that the era of unchallenged entitlement was over. With a blend of methodical strategy and genuine community outreach, I was gradually dismantling her power. Even in the small gestures, a well-kept lawn, a thoughtful remark at the meeting, the message was clear: respect and accountability now reigned in our neighborhood. By the time the season's first leaves began to fall, I was confident that Eleanor's days as the uncontested neighborhood matriarch were numbered. The retribution I had so carefully engineered was unfolding quietly, yet inexorably, leaving behind the promise of a fairer, more authentic community. After the seeds of change had been sown within the community, I turned my attention to the broader implications of Eleanor Peterson's reign. The public humiliation at the block party had been a watershed moment, but I knew that lasting transformation required systemic change. I began strategizing how to further erode the power structures that had once shielded her. Over the following weeks, I attended every additional homeowners association meeting and community event. I advocated for revised policies that promoted transparency and accountability, a direct counter to the secretive ways in which Eleanor had operated for years. I suggested forming a committee dedicated to auditing community finances and establishing clear protocols for dispute resolution. Many residents, emboldened by recent events, supported these initiatives. As the agenda of our meetings began to shift, Eleanor found herself increasingly isolated. No longer was she the sole arbiter of community values, her ideas were now being openly challenged, and alternative voices were emerging. At the same time, I focused on personal reinvention. I continued to improve my own property, knowing well that a striking contrast would serve as a constant reminder of what a real homeowner should represent. I invested in sustainable landscaping, installed solar-powered lights along my walkway, and even organized a neighborhood garden day, inviting residents to participate in beautifying our shared spaces. These efforts not only strengthened community bonds but also subtly sent a message: unity, innovation, and respect were our new norms. I also made it a point to nurture relationships with those who had once been intimidated by Eleanor's dominating presence. I spent weekends hosting small barbecues and informal discussion sessions in my backyard, where I would share stories and listen to what others had experienced under her rule. Every shared laugh and every nod of agreement further cemented a slowly building alliance against entitlement. I realized that by empowering others to speak up, I was indirectly restoring a measure of fairness that had long been absent. Behind the scenes, I continued to expand my file on Eleanor, diligently updating it with new testimonies, overlooked details, and corroborated facts. This dossier became my silent arsenal, carefully compiled evidence of a fabricated public image that masked decades of bullying and unethical practices. I shared snippets of this information discreetly with influential community figures, generating further momentum for reform. Local news outlets, intrigued by the whispers of scandal and systemic abuse, began to request interviews with residents. I maintained my respectful anonymity, encouraging people to speak freely about their experiences without fear. The collective storytelling reinforced the reality that Eleanor's rule was built on lies, and that change was not only necessary but inevitable. One evening, after a particularly spirited HOA meeting, a senior neighbor pulled me aside and said, "Detective Wilcox, you've given us hope. For the first time in years, I believe we can have our neighborhood back." Her words were a testament to how far we had come. Every suggestion I made, every policy I championed, was gradually chipping away at the old order. Despite the progress, I never lost sight of my personal objective, to ensure that Eleanor would one day be held fully accountable for all her misdeeds. As more residents began to question her legacy and her leadership, it became increasingly clear that the old guard was crumbling. The system was finally striking back, through democratic reform, community solidarity, and a relentless pursuit of truth. In the end, what started as a personal vendetta over an unwarranted 911 call had grown into a much larger movement for change. My quiet, methodical efforts had not only undermined an entitled despot but also forged a pathway for genuine, collective empowerment. And while Eleanor's power was diminishing day by day, I continued to build on every small victory, knowing that lasting change was within our grasp. With the community increasingly awakened to the truth about Eleanor Peterson, I knew that the final phase of my plan had to be executed with precision and subtlety. It was time to ensure that her influence was no longer viable, and that the neighborhood could finally move past the era of unchallenged entitlement. I began by leveraging every bit of the alliances I had nurtured. Neighbors once cowed into silence now found their voices and began openly criticizing Eleanor's arbitrary rules. In our monthly HOA meetings, I made sure to politely challenge any misguided proposals, always referencing the need for transparency and fairness. My efforts culminated in a comprehensive proposal to revise our community guidelines, which, when passed by a unanimous vote, sidelined many of Eleanor's old mandates. The sense of empowerment was palpable, and as more residents expressed their appreciation for a fairer system, Eleanor's authority dwindled further. Meanwhile, I continued to strengthen my public image. I attended local events and participated in community service initiatives that not only showcased my commitment to the neighborhood but also highlighted the contrast between a proactive homeowner and Eleanor's outdated, authoritarian style. I organized neighborhood cleanups, fundraisers for local schools, and even a Green Day that celebrated sustainable living. Each event was a small victory against the stifling dominance she had once imposed. At the same time, I maintained my private campaign, the slow, methodical collection of evidence that would one day serve as undeniable proof of Eleanor's misdeeds. I updated my dossier regularly, adding testimonies from neighbors who had suffered her bullying, financial records exposing her connection to illicit schemes, and even records of disputes that revealed her vindictive tendencies. Every piece of evidence was catalogued meticulously, reinforcing the narrative that Eleanor's pristine image was nothing more than a well-honed facade. I wasn't content with only undermining her at the meetings, I also made efforts to influence her close social circle. At dinner parties and casual gatherings, I would gently drop hints about discrepancies in her stories, always couched in concern and curiosity. Have you ever wondered about the origins of some of these historical records? I'd ask softly, inviting conversation rather than confrontation. My neighbors began to share their own experiences, and soon the ripple effect was undeniable. Her long-standing allies, once fiercely loyal, started to distance themselves when the truth became harder to ignore. Every subtle act of defiance, every small victory at a meeting or community event, contributed to a gradual but unmistakable shift in power. I even employed a bit of clever wordplay in the local newsletter, drafting editorials that championed transparency and invited residents to rethink what true community leadership meant. It wasn't long before the tide had turned, and the neighborhood started to see Eleanor for who she truly was, a manipulator whose vision was as stale as the overgrown grass she so despised. One evening, after a particularly heated HOA session, I received a quiet word of thanks from a longtime resident. "Detective Wilcox," she said, "you've not only stood up for us, you've awakened us." Her gratitude resonated deeply with me, affirming that our collective efforts were yielding real change. By the time the winter chill began to set in, it was clear that Eleanor's grip on the community was irrevocably loosened. I had helped pave the way for a more democratic, open neighborhood, and in doing so, I had forged bonds of trust and solidarity that would endure far beyond any single confrontation. And so, with every meeting attended, every small act of public service carried out, and every confidential piece of evidence securely stored, I continued my silent mission to ensure that justice and fairness prevailed over entitlement. In the twilight of that transformative season, I knew that the final chapters of Eleanor's reign were drawing near, and that our neighborhood had finally reclaimed its right to self-determination. One crisp Saturday morning, as I tended to the now immaculate front yard of my bungalow, I noticed an unusual sight. Eleanor Peterson, once the relentless force of entitlement, was approaching my driveway, not in her customary high-handed manner, but dressed in simple, unassuming attire. Gone was her signature pastel blazer and ostentatious accessories. She now wore a faded cardigan and plain slacks, her demeanor markedly subdued. In one hand, she clutched a worn-out toolkit, the other hesitantly reaching out as if in apology. "Terence," she began softly, I owe you an apology." I paused, surprised at the vulnerability in her voice. For the first time, the once unyielding Eleanor seemed human, a woman burdened by regret. "I realize now that my behavior was not only disruptive but harmful," she continued, avoiding my eyes. "I've been living under a false idea of what it means to be in charge, and I see now that I've hurt my neighbors, and you, in the process." Her words, though halting, carried genuine remorse. I regarded her cautiously, remembering all the subtle invasions of my peace and the deliberate undermining of the community. "And why now?" I asked, my tone neutral yet curious. She sighed. "Since you've changed the way things are here, I've seen that maybe I was wrong. I've even taken some classes to learn a bit about home maintenance and community responsibilities." That admission was unexpected, a sincere effort to reinvent herself. I nodded slowly, uncertain whether to accept her apology outright. "I appreciate your words, Eleanor. Change is not easy, but actions speak louder than declarations." We stood there in the quiet morning light, two figures on a shared suburban street, each with a past of errors and a future of possibility. "I'd like to try making things right," she said, offering to help maintain our shared alley and even volunteer at the next neighborhood meeting. A gesture so small yet so significant. I accepted her offer with guarded optimism, aware that time would be the true judge of her transformation. That day, as I resumed my yard work, I couldn't help but reflect that sometimes the most unexpected reconciliation can start with a simple apology. In that brief encounter, the seeds of change were sown. A promise that even the hardiest hearts can soften and evolve with effort and time. And as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows over our quiet street, I let go of the lingering resentment, open to the idea that the community, and even Eleanor, could finally find a way to mend old wounds. In the weeks following our unexpected reconciliation, Eleanor Peterson steadily proved that her apology was not empty words. I began noticing changes not only in her attitude but in her actions. One warm afternoon, while I was polishing my beloved iron stallion in the driveway, I saw her approaching with a determined look and a set of tools clutched in her hands. "Terence," she said tentatively, "I've been taking those classes seriously. I've learned how to fix things, and I thought, I'd like to help with your bike. Let me see if I can tune it up." Despite my initial reluctance, I saw a spark of genuine desire in her eyes. I agreed, handing over the keys and giving her space in my garage. Over the ensuing weeks, Eleanor became a fixture in my workspace. Each time she worked on the bike, she absorbed new techniques and honed her skills. There were small setbacks, a misadjusted spark plug here, an oil spill there, but her perseverance was unmistakable. I marveled at her transformation from a domineering busybody to a focused, if slightly clumsy, mechanic. One day, after a particularly long session, Eleanor emerged from the garage with a cautious smile. "I believe I've got it," she said, her voice tinged with both nervous excitement and pride. I turned the key, and the iron stallion roared to life, running smoother and with more power than ever before. That was impressive, I admitted, a rare note of genuine praise in my voice. Neighbors started to notice, too, and soon the conversation shifted from gossip about the past to admiration for newfound talents. Eleanor's redemption was becoming a living, breathing reality. One that softened even the hardest hearts in our community. Her transformation was symbolized by small gestures. One sunny afternoon, I even caught a glimpse of her smiling as she helped an elderly neighbor fix a broken fence post. Her earlier belligerence all but melted away. While I remained cautious, I allowed myself to believe that redemption was indeed possible for even the most notorious of recluses. As the months passed, the repercussions of Eleanor Peterson's unmasking continued to ripple throughout the neighborhood. But the final twist in this saga proved that sometimes, karma delivers its lessons in unexpected ways. Shortly after the dramatic block party and subsequent reforms, a startling revelation emerged from Eleanor's confidential file. It turned out that her late husband had amassed wealth through illicit schemes, money laundering that Eleanor had proudly perpetuated behind closed doors. In a desperate bid to protect her image, she had cooperated with authorities and, in doing so, unwittingly betrayed her closest allies. A few weeks later, I received a letter from her attorney. The letter detailed how, to save herself from complete ruin, Eleanor had offered information on her criminal associates. One name on that list turned out to be none other than a high-ranking official from our own department, the very police chief whose corruption had plagued our ranks for years. In the ensuing investigations, that chief was arrested, and the resulting cleanup led to an unprecedented shakeup in leadership. Before I could fully comprehend the irony, I was summoned. In a twist that no one could have predicted, I was promoted to a top position within the Metro Police. Suddenly, my hard-won battle with an entitled neighbor had not only restored balance in the community but had advanced my career in ways I'd never anticipated. At a celebratory dinner that same evening, the neighborhood buzzed with the news. Residents marveled at the dramatic turnaround, and I couldn't help but reflect on the strange twists of fate. Eleanor's misdeeds had not only brought her downfall, but they had also paved the way for justice to be served at a higher level. Sometimes, I mused to a friend, the best revenge is a promotion. The irony was delicious. Meanwhile, Eleanor was left to face the consequences of her actions. Her assets were frozen, her influence in the homeowners association dismantled, and her once revered status reduced to ashes. The community moved on, empowered by the knowledge that entitlement does not go unpunished. As I looked out over the neighborhood from my porch that night, my heart swelled with a mixture of vindication and bittersweet irony. The journey had been long and fraught with unexpected turns, but ultimately, it reinforced the timeless truth. Justice, no matter how slow or unusual its delivery, always finds a way. And in the end, while Eleanor's legacy crumbled, I emerged not only as a respected member of the community but also as a leader in the very system I once served, a true testament to the unpredictable rewards of perseverance.